Okay, now we're getting to the next part of the our little studies with the boys in the book of Daniel, and we've seen how they stood out. We've seen how they stood together, and now we're looking at the time when they stood up. Now, one man has said, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And in Daniel 3, we read that Nebuchadnezzar had erected a gold statue of himself. It was 90 feet high, 9 feet wide, on the plain of Dura. And he invited all the dignitaries of Babylon to the opening ceremony. It was going to be quite a big, elaborate thing. Now, Daniel was not present in this place and at this time. Many Bible scholars think that because of the new position he'd been given by the king, Daniel may have been actually out of the country on official business at the time. But his three friends were still there: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they were prepared to stand up for the truth. And if Daniel had been there, he would have been standing too. In fact, we know from a later story in Daniel chapter 6, under a new king, Darius the Mede, that Daniel also defied the edict of the king and continued to pray to God when he was told not to. And this action of standing up for his faith led to Daniel being thrown into a den of lions. But back to the time of these three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nebuchadnezzar made the crowd an offer that they just could not or dare not refuse. As soon as the people heard the music playing, they had a very stark choice between bowing down to the statue or being thrown into a blazing furnace. Now, this was an easy choice for most people. But when the music sounded, three young men remained standing. While others were bowing down, these three stood up. While other Jewish exiles were on their faces, thinking of excuses why their actions were not blatant idolatry, these three boys stood tall. And after being spotted, they were brought before the king, and he explained the whole thing to them again and gave them a second chance. Listen to the music, bow down. But their response to the king is one of the boldest declarations of trust in God in the whole of Scripture. In Daniel chapter 3, verses 17 to 18, we read these words: "If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you've set up." They would not bow. They would stand up for their faith. You see, they were operating at the same level of super faith as Esther when pleading for the life of her people. You might remember the story. She had been told that she'd been brought to royal position for such a time as this. And under the great threat, she said, "I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." See, regardless of personal consequences, I have to do the right thing. And as little children, these three young men had been taught the 10 Commandments. And the admonition not to make or worship idols was drilled into their heads and into their hearts. So now the choice is quite clear. And there is no way, after all that God had done for them, that they would give their worship to anyone or anything else. And even when given a second chance to bow to the idol, they didn't fall victim to doubt, and they didn't waver in their faith. The king could threaten all he wanted to. They still stood. They understood, and they submitted to the bit that they said, "But even if he does not deliver us." You see, they trusted in God's omnipotence. They knew that he could save them, but they also rested in God's sovereignty. They knew that he might not choose to. But whether God saved them from the fire or not was irrelevant. And they were making no demands in service. They were not bartering with God as we sometimes do. You know, "God, if you do this, I'll do that. I mean, get me out of the furnace and I'll be a good boy. Or I'll serve you as long as it's not too painful or not too inconvenient. Or if God doesn't do what we expect him to do or doesn't see fit to answer our prayers as and when we determine, we reserve the right to complain and to backslide." These young men were not your normal run-of-the-mill people. They were strangers and aliens on this earth. They had different priorities. See, the fact is, they feared God more than they feared the king. And they loved God more than they loved their own lives. And at that point, they had no guarantee of survival. I think it's time for us all to stand up for our faith against the misunderstanding of people or the threats from the enemy. It is time to stand, and having done all, to stand. I'm still standing, with no guarantee of a pleasant outcome. Now, in the book of Hebrews, we read the great catalogue of heroes of the faith in chapter 11. And after talking about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and a host of others who, through faith, conquered kingdoms, administered justice, gained what was promised, shut the mouths of lions, there's Daniel, quenched the fury of the flames, there's these boys, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. Isn't that fantastic? All great and exciting stuff. But the same chapter goes directly on to say there were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they may gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith. And these boys, with no guarantee of either success or failure, stood up for what they believed in. These young men in the book of Daniel stood out, stood together, and they stood up. But that's not the end. They stood the test of their faith. And we'll see that the next time. Okay? Stay safe. Look after yourselves. God bless you. See you soon.